Good morning and welcome to another message in this series, Outnumbered, where we look at circumstances in the Bible where characters or groups of people were outnumbered, where they faced opposition that seemed overwhelming and too great to gain a victory against, and yet God delivered them and brought about a great victory or a great deliverance. And perhaps today you're feeling outnumbered. Perhaps today you feel alone. Well, take courage and faith today that God wants to bring about a great deliverance for you in your situation. Today we're looking at a great story that can be found in Numbers chapter 13 and 14, when 12 spies entered the promised land on a scouting mission to survey and to see what God had promised for them and to check what was there before they took possession of the land. I'd recommend that you hit pause on this message right now and take a few minutes to read Numbers chapter 13 and Numbers chapter 14. And having read those two chapters, let's take a look at what went on in that story together. A great story of faith in spite of incredible opposition. By way of context, the Israelites had journeyed for a couple of years from their deliverance, from their escape from Egypt, from their exodus, escaping Pharaoh and the years of captivity and slavery. Moses had received the Ten Commandments on Sinai, and here they are a couple of years into their newfound freedom, approaching the promised land. And Moses, being the incredibly gifted and strategic leader that he was, he selected some capable men to go on a spying mission, a scouting mission, to assess and to survey the land, to gain a report on what lay in store for them, so they could strategize about how they could take possession of what God had promised. And Moses selected a man from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And those are listed at the beginning of Numbers chapter 13. And one thing that I've noticed that's important to note is that these were leaders in their own tribes. These 12 men who were selected were leaders in their own tribes. These were men who had gifting, men who had ability, men who had a proven track record. And they were selected out of all of their tribe to go on this incredibly dangerous and an incredible scouting mission. These weren't just any people, these were gifted people who had proven themselves in leadership. And these spies, their names are listed there in Numbers, the beginning of Numbers chapter 13. They were given a really detailed briefing. I kind of picture this as being like what you see in the Hollywood films, where there's some military film and you see the soldiers lined up in front of their commanding officer, being given a briefing of the mission that lay ahead. And let's take a look at the briefing that they were given by Moses. Numbers chapter 13 verse 17. Moses said to them, "Go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or is it bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or is it poor? Are there trees on it or not? And do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land." These elite leaders were given detailed instructions on what information they were to obtain on their scouting mission. And so these men, having received their briefing, they set off on their journey. They set off and surveyed the land and travelled throughout it. The journey, the trip took 40 days for them to complete. And scholars tell us that from the places that they visited, the round trip was approximately 500 miles, which equates to about 12.5 miles a day for 40 days. Not only were these leaders gifted and had a proven track record, but they were fit. They covering that amount of ground over that period of time. They were men who were fit and had stamina and resolve. And not only were they able just to carry themselves and their equipment, but they brought back some of the produce, some of the fruit of the land. They brought back clusters of grapes to show to Moses and the Israelite people. A great introduction there, which sets the scene for what went on. But let's see what happened when they returned. So they came back towards the end of Numbers 13, and they brought their report, and they said, yes, the land is good. Yes, there is fruit there. There is milk and honey, just as we were told. But there's also other things which are a bit more of a problem. There's other things which aren't so attractive or aren't so good, really. We wish they weren't there. There's huge giants. There's fortified cities. There's opposition. There's people already there. It's going to be a bit tricky. They came back and they sowed a negative report on the land. I can imagine these spies as they're walking around playing that game I Spy. That game that we've all played when we were on car journeys with our families. I spy with my little eye something beginning with. And I can imagine some of these spies, as they were going round, they could see the opposition and the problems and the difficulty, the obstacles, and they played I Spy on their journey. I spy with my little eye something beginning with F for fortified cities. I spy with my little eye something beginning with P, powerful people groups already inhabiting the land. I spy with my little eye something beginning with G, great big giants. So although there was land flowing with milk and honey and there was lush fruit in the land, there were also problems which they saw. But not everyone came back with a negative voice. Out of the 12 men who went on this game of I Spy in the Promised Land, there were 2 who came back with a positive report, and their names are Caleb and Joshua. They were outnumbered. They stood vulnerable and in the minority because they spoke up and they stayed true and they continued to believe the promises that God had made. There were 10 voices that came back with negative reports of the land, but there were 2 voices who gave a positive account. They were outnumbered. Have you ever felt like you were outnumbered? You were giving a positive report or trying to say something positive or holding on to truth, and yet all the voices around you seem to be negative. What a hard place, what a tough place that is. Perhaps you're in a place today where you're trying to speak positivity and hold on to the truth of God's promises, yet all the voices around you, which seem so loud and so continual, are speaking negativity and speaking words that sow fear and doubt. What a tough place that must have been for Caleb and Joshua, because they came back with positive reports. And it got really tough for Caleb and Joshua in their positive reports, because if you read through Numbers 13 and 14, the opposition to them intensified. Initially it began with complaining and grumbling when they spoke up positively, but it led to greater opposition. It led to the people saying, well, let's just go back to Egypt. Let's appoint some other leaders who will take us back to captivity and to slavery, because that's more attractive. A regression, a retreat, a failure to go through on what God had promised, a regression and a retreat back to Egypt. It suddenly seemed more attractive to them to have suffering and captivity in Egypt than pushing through and believing God to fulfill his promises in the Promised Land. And it got so bad for Caleb and Joshua that in fact the people talked of stoning them. They were going to lose their lives for standing their ground in faith. But God intervened, and you can read that as you've read in Numbers chapter 14. But the positive reports that Caleb and Joshua brought back are so refreshing in comparison. In verse 30 of Numbers chapter 13, after an initial negative perspective on the promised land, it says that Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." I've just got a few observations about faith. This is a great account, a great story, a great example of faith in action as we see how Caleb continued to speak and stand his ground. A great story of faith in action. And today, if you're outnumbered, let's look at Caleb and Joshua and see how we can learn some lessons to grow in our faith and become stronger in our faith, to stand our ground in our faith. And I've got 4 observations about faith. Faith has a voice. Faith has a focus. Faith has a memory. And faith also has a reward. The first one, faith's voice. Caleb stands up and speaks positively to the people, to the whole people. It says there that he silenced the people. In Numbers 13, verse 30, Caleb silenced the people before Moses, and he gave that positive report. You know, sometimes faith just needs to speak louder than the opposition. If you're in a place of feeling outnumbered, speak louder than the opposition. Turn the praise on and turn the praise up. You know, a great way to grow in faith is just to get the praise songs going and to declare faith in your own home, to continue to speak words of faith and words of life. And that's what Caleb did. Caleb put the opposition on mute. In this era of lockdown with fighting coronavirus, a lot of us are having to grasp new technology and learn how to use it effectively. And I've seen some funny stories on the lighter moments of lockdown where I've seen, and perhaps you have too, of people who thought they had used the mute function effectively on their video conferencing call, only to realise that it actually wasn't on mute. And sometimes some people are speaking in conference calls that I've held and taken part in. People are speaking when in fact their voice, their microphone is turned off and they can't be heard. The thought just came to me that that's what we should do to the negative voices, to the voices that sow doubt and unbelief. Let's put them on mute and let's allow faith's voice to be heard all the more. You know, these 10 spies who brought back the negative reports, they brought back some fact, but a lot of it was laced with their own opinion. There were 10 voices of opinion about unbelief and negativity, but there were 2 voices who held on to the truth. Just because the negative voices are perhaps more in number doesn't mean that they're right. If you're in a place of in the minority this morning in a situation, if you're feeling outnumbered, continue to stand firm. Continue to raise your voice of faith in the situation, and God will come through and prove himself and bring about a great deliverance for you. You know, Caleb, through these 2 chapters, continued to make great confessions, and that's what faith's voice is. It's a great confession of faith. You know, it's a powerful thing to confess what you believe. And Caleb, I'm sure, and Joshua, as they stood their ground and stood firm on God's promises and talked about what could be achieved and what was possible, I'm sure their faith grew within them as they declared the truth and declared their belief. It's a great example for us too in our situations, and for you in your situation. Make a great confession this morning of your faith. Caleb said that they should go up and take possession of the land because they can certainly do it. Later on in Numbers 14, he continues to make great confessions. He says, don't be afraid of the people because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but God is with us. Great example of faith's voice in action. So you today make a great confession, cause faith's voice to turn up and cause the opposition, the opposing voices, the voices of fear and doubt and unbelief, put them on mute today so that they cannot be heard. The second thing that faith has is that faith has a focus. Faith has a focus. So I'm intrigued how the 10 spies came back with a negative report, and they described themselves as being grasshoppers against giants. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we seemed the same to them. That's the last verse in Numbers chapter 13. We feel so small and insignificant, and they thought the same too. I remember when in my school football career, my school cricket career, I played in some great sporting matches in my school days. Some great memories for me. I love a good game of football or cricket, and I remember a couple of occasions where the opposition just seemed invincible. I remember turning up to one game of football in particular, and the guys on the opposing team were huge. They were massive. And at school, I was actually quite a short guy till in my late teens. I was what you might say a late developer. I was the one who was on the front row of the annual school photo, where all the shorter people sat. I was like that at school, and but I played in centre midfield on the school football team in the middle of the action. And I remember we were lining up for one game of football, and the opposing centre midfielders, where the action is, where the battle of the game is won, they were massive in comparison to me. And I just remember feeling very insignificant and very small. I remember thinking, how am I going to go up for a header against these guys? How am I going to win any challenge in the air? Because I'm just so small. I've got no chance. And this negative thinking and this fear just gripped me. But I realised then, and I learned very quickly in that game and in other games, that I did have some positive attributes that I could bring. That whilst I was perhaps shorter in height at that time, I was actually quite quick and agile on the floor. And I could move the ball around, and I could find a way to get around them, and I was perhaps more agile than these great big lads who were much bigger than me. Faith has a focus. The 10 spies focused on their shortcomings and their limitations, but faith's focus is on God. Abraham was another great man who had a journey of faith, just like these 12 spies, and he's a great father of faith, if you will, and a great story of faith, how he went from where he was in the land, and God took him to the land of Canaan. And it describes Abraham's journey to fatherhood as a great journey of faith, and how he had a focus. He didn't bury his head in the sand about the facts, but his faith had a focus. And it says in Romans chapter 4 that against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old. and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. Abraham had a great focus in his faith. He faced the facts, but he believed the promise. He didn't bury his head in the sand and pretend that the facts weren't there, that the shortcomings and the limitations weren't there, but he didn't make those his focus. He maintained his focus on God. And that's what we should do in our circumstances too, is not allow fear to be the focus or unbelief to be the focus, but focus on the one who gives the promise. At the beginning of Numbers chapter 13, God reminds Moses and reminds the people of the promise that he has for them. He says to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land which I am giving to the Israelites." I am giving. There's a certainty about the promise. God has promised that it would happen. This is the promise that God gave to Moses all those years back at the burning bush in the wilderness. And here we are on the brink of its fulfillment. Faith has a focus. God is true to his word. You know, the spies came back from their spying trip, their mission behind enemy lines, and their account was this: yes, the land does indeed flow with milk and honey. God is true to his word. The land has milk and honey. It's fertile, it's lush, it's abundant in everything it contains. God is true to his word. We've just got to focus on God and the promises that he brings. You know, and the third thing that faith has is faith has a memory. When in Numbers 14 we see a dialogue between Moses and God where God is angry and displeased and wants to bring punishment and judgment on those for their unbelief. And God says this to Moses in verse 11: "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in spite of all the miraculous signs which I have performed among them?" Sometimes in the difficulty, in the struggle, when the circumstances seem overwhelming, when we're outnumbered in that sense, sometimes we can forget what God has done before. And God's exasperated with Moses and says, how much longer? How can they not remember all that I've done for them? This is the God who delivered them and brought them out of captivity. They were slaves, and yet he had made them free. They were trapped by the Red Sea, and yet God parted the seas and they walked through on dry ground. Their enemies were overcome by the waters. God had brought them about and given them a great freedom, a great deliverance. He had given them identity as a people. He had led them and provided for them with manna and quail in the wilderness. He had sustained them day by day. He had led them and guided them with pillars of cloud by day and fire by night. God had performed all these miraculous signs for them, and yet they couldn't continue to believe. Perhaps that their memory of these events faded because the giants seemed so big and they seemed so small. The people seemed so powerful. The fortified cities seemed so great. It's important for you to remember God's faithfulness and his miracles that he has performed for you and those near you in times gone past. We can take great confidence, can't we? In a moment of struggle, in a moment where we need God to deliver us, when we're outnumbered and in difficulty, that we can look back and call to mind the great things that God has done before. That's why your testimony is so powerful and so important. To speak and to share what God has done in your life. And this morning, you may have a story to tell of God's faithfulness and God's provision and God's miraculous turning up in your life. Share your story. It will cause faith to rise in your heart, and it will cause faith to rise in those who hear it. And it's important that we don't forget God's faithfulness. Faith has a memory. And the final thing that faith has is that faith has a reward. Faith has a voice. Faith has a focus. Faith has a memory. And faith has a reward. As you read through Numbers chapter 14, you'll see that as a consequence of their unbelief, the Israelites cannot enter the promised land, and they're sent on a 40-year wandering because of this moment of decision where they chose unbelief over faith. God says, well, you can't enter. This generation has to die before a new generation arises that will believe and can enter the promised land. 1 year of wandering for every day that the spies spent in the land. And the spies themselves, who brought back negativity and unbelief, contrary to God's promise, paid for it with their very lives. You know, unbelief brings death, but faith brings life. Faith has a reward. Only Caleb and Joshua, out of all of those spies, entered the promised land. Only Caleb and Joshua, out of that entire generation, they were the only two to actually enter the promised land. We know a bit about Joshua, don't we? We know how he assumed the leadership of the Israelites after the death of Moses, and he was the one who led them in and led them up against those fortified cities and those giants and those powerful people groups, and led the people to take possession of the land. But less is known about Caleb. But there's a great account, a great chapter in Joshua chapter 14 about Caleb. And it says this, Joshua chapter 14 and verse 6. And it's a conversation that Caleb has with Joshua. And he says, you know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. I brought back a report according to my convictions, but my brothers who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years, since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord has promised me that day. You yourself heard that the Anakites were there and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out, just as he said. Wow. Faith has a reward. Caleb was patient. I wonder how Caleb and Joshua felt wandering the land for 40 years, wandering the wilderness. But God brought them into the land just as he had promised, and he had an inheritance for Caleb. And Caleb, at 85 years old, continued to believe the promise and took possession and received his inheritance. So if you're outnumbered today, if the situation seems too great, if it seems too overwhelming for you, then learn the lessons that we can see from Caleb and Joshua. Faith has a voice. Faith has a focus. Faith has a memory. And faith has a reward. May God deliver you today, and may he bring you to your promised land. God bless you.